And we are rolling. Hey, Sam.
Hi.
So this is Mark Goldberg with UN Dispatch, speaking with Sam Bell of the Genocide Intervention Network. As the name of Sam of your organization might suggest, we're going to be talking a bit about the sort of not so cheery topic of genocide. But this has been in the news a lot recently. This week, the administration finally, after many months, completed its Sudan policy review. So we're going to talk about the result of that review. But I think first, by way of introduction, it might be useful to sort of explain who you are and what the Genocide Intervention Network is for our viewers.
Sure. Well, so Genocide Intervention Network, and we abbreviate it and call ourselves GINet. We were founded in 2005, and we're really coming out of this school of thought that Samantha Power wrote about, that in order to be able to prevent and respond in an effective way to genocide, mass atrocities, we really need to generate the political will to do that. And so we're trying to build a national constituency across the country to do all sorts of things, but really the primary goal is to hold our leaders accountable for the right policies on prevention and response to genocide and mass atrocities. And our constituency includes the STAND chapters that some of your viewers might be familiar with. We have 1,000 student chapters across the country, and we have an adult leadership program called the Carl Wilkins Fellowship. Carl Wilkins was the only American to stay in Rwanda during the genocide in 1994. Just a regular guy who was there doing some relief work, and the embassy asked everybody to evacuate. He said, "No, I'm staying here. I've made relationships with people here, and I intend to do what I can." And so we see that these community leaders across the country in the United States, in so many different states and cities, doing the same thing Carl did, but just not on the ground, doing it through advocacy, awareness raising, etc. And then the other big piece of what we're up to is working with companies. We started the Sudan divestment movement, and we got 27 states to pass laws, got many dozens of universities, and passed a federal piece of legislation. This is, again, trying to get targeted pressure on the Khartoum regime and looking at a select group of companies operating in Sudan in a number of sectors that don't really benefit Sudanese and provide huge resources to Khartoum. And these sectors are also where companies are committing abuses on their own. So we've just kind of relaunched that piece of what we're doing, calling it the Conflict Risk Network. And basically,
I think we'll get to that.
Okay, we'll get to that. Okay.
Certainly, we'll definitely get to some of the divestment stuff. So that's pretty interesting. But I think, long story short, it's fair to say that you are an advocate, and you are deep into the advocacy community.
Yes.
And I wanted to invite you on this week because I think it's fair to say that the advocacy community has been less than pleased with the Obama administration's sort of early moves on Darfur and on Sudan more broadly. And sort of this week, as I said on Monday, finally after many months of waiting and of pressure, frankly, by you guys, the administration finally released its Sudan policy review. I wanted to ask you, I guess, first, what were the sources of your frustration with the Obama administration up till, let's say, Monday, when the policy review was released?
Yeah, so we had very high expectations for the Obama administration because of the very active role that Senator Obama took in this issue, the forceful rhetoric he was using on the campaign trail, and frankly the promises he made to Sudan. And so the first miss, I think, in our mind was we had this announcement that on March 4th the ICC was going to announce whether or not they were going to issue an arrest warrant for President Bashir. And there were many people who saw this as a potential flashpoint in the history of Sudan and a potentially volatile moment for Sudanese civilians. And we had been lobbying all throughout the transition and on the campaign for the first thing to be the appointment of a special envoy, and we really didn't get that envoy before March 4th. So we felt in the intervening days, in the next 2 weeks after Bashir kicked out the humanitarian aid organizations, we really didn't have a focus for U.S. leadership to try to address the situation. I think that was the first big miss. There have been a number of issues that we've had with the President Obama's special envoy, who he did appoint later in March, and it started from the first time he went to Khartoum and said that, and remember again, this is 2 weeks after the humanitarian aid groups have been expelled. Many people are at risk. And he said, he used very conciliatory language, and he said, I'm trying to start over. There have been a few other issues along the way, and I'll just name a few. I mean, one is we had some misunderstandings about the sanctions. We thought he was talking or suggesting that sanctions were not worthwhile, and moreover, that they hadn't been targeted in a way that was going to put pressure on the leadership in Khartoum versus what he would say are regular Sudanese. And there's been a lot of work done to make sure that the sanctions are much more targeted than they were initially. And so we saw that as one, that he wasn't being candid about the sanctions regime, and two, again, we didn't feel like Khartoum had done anything to warrant us talking about lifting sanctions. He has since clarified and said that's not what I was saying about sanctions. He's quoted as saying that his diplomatic strategy with respect to Khartoum is focused on trying to give gold stars and cookies, and talking about sort of incentives in a flippant way and in a way that we didn't feel like reflected how change could actually be made in Khartoum. And then there have been beyond American activists, there are real concerns from communities in Darfur and communities in South Sudan who feel that Gratian is not confronting the government in the way that he should be. And particularly constituencies in southern Sudan are have been worried that General Gratian is not going to demand strict implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, that he's going to allow for some renegotiations of key provisions on the CPA, which is, for Southern Sudanese, that's their golden document.
I think just interrupt you for a second. I think it's fair to say that most advocates, the people, folks in sort of the Darfur Sudan advocacy communities, did not approve of the direction that policy seemed to be going under the president's special envoy to Sudan, Scott Gratian. I think that's fair to say, and it seems that some groups even called for him to resign, and it seems as if I guess my next question to you is, you've explained sort of why that is the case. Can you maybe explain sort of what sort of took so long for this review to be completed? Because as you know, Obama came into office promising to do this comprehensive Sudan policy review within 60 days, and meanwhile 7 months later it came out.
Yeah.
So you had Gratian on the one side, and who was pushing back against Gratian?
So we've had press reports that Susan Rice pushed back pretty hard on Gratian. Initially on his characterizing the situation as or remnants of genocide versus ongoing genocide, but then on the inclusion of pressures or sticks in the actual policy that the administration was going to release. I honestly don't know what accounted for the delay. I think it's fair to say that the expectations game was very poorly managed. They told us after the appointment of Special Envoy Gratian, again, this was in March, that it would be a few weeks, and we kept hearing, treat this as just an initial foray, but our policy will be rolled out, soon. So don't take anything the Special Envoy is saying as indicative of U.S. policy. Wait for the policy, and then we had to wait for all these months. And I think that there's nothing so revolutionary in the document that was rolled out this past week.
Why don't you actually? This is a good point. Why don't can you explain sort of what that document said, and sort of offer your maybe reaction to it?
Yeah, I mean it identifies 3 priorities for U.S. policy with respect to Sudan. 1 is implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. 2 is getting a peace deal for Darfur. 3 is ensuring that Sudan remains a partner on counterterrorism. And I think the main message of the press conference that was held with Hillary Clinton and Ambassador Rice and Gratian was to say, we're not going to give anything until there's verifiable progress. And we know that the government of Sudan has lied many times before, so we're not expecting that they're just going to reform themselves just because President Obama is in power. That's my words, but I think that was the point of the press conference. But really, when it gets down to the nuts and bolts in terms of what they'd be willing to offer Sudan and what pressures they have in their back pocket should they not get cooperation from Khartoum or other actors in Sudan, they didn't give anything. I mean, they talked about a classified annex to their policy, and I think people don't really know what to think about that.
What's this classified annex?
So there's a public version of the policy which they released, and then there's a classified version which have the pressures and the incentives in it supposedly. Who knows? I mean, who knows if they actually exist at all? But I think people generally know what the incentives are: lifting sanctions, normalizing relations, taking government of Sudan off the state sponsor of terrorism list. Pressures are less clear, and previous special envoys have talked pretty openly about pressures. Andrew Natsios famously talked for a while about Plan B financial sanctions. We call them Plan B sanctions. Rich Williamson talked about blockading Port Sudan and jamming Khartoum's radio signals. And Special Envoy Gratian really hasn't said anything about pressures or sticks, so to speak. And when we went into the White House this past week after the policy was released, and we were talking to folks, and one of the things that we said was, I know you're not rolling out a pressures package or a sanctions package today, but one of the things that you got to consider is that meaningful pressure has to be multilateral, and a lot of these pressures take time to put in place. It's not like you can snap your fingers and all of a sudden you'll have the EU mimicking financial sanctions that the U.S. has put on Khartoum. So one of the things we're pressing them on is, even if you're not ready to release pressures now or impose additional sticks now, are you doing the groundwork to make sure that, should they be needed, you'll have the ability to put them in place?
Well, I guess that kind of begs the question. I mean, what opportunities exist for multilateral, sanctions or pressure against Sudan?
Yeah.
There have been in I believe 2005 there was a round of individual targeted sanctions leveled against the Sudan at the Security Council. But that didn't seem to affect much. Those were kind of limited. What can happen multilaterally? Particularly considering the kind of allies that Sudan seems to have among other powerful players in the international community.
Yeah, there's a few things. One, My colleagues at the Save Darfur Coalition have been talking a lot recently about debt relief, and Sudan is seeking pretty substantial debt relief, and one of their messages is before any debt is forgiven, we should be demanding X, Y, and Z from the government of Sudan, namely, progress on Darfur and CPA. Second thing is, one of the things that Khartoum has been talking about for many years is transitioning away from dollar reserves and transactions in dollars and trying to operate in euros. And so targeted EU financial sanctions that mimicked some of the really targeted sanctions that the U.S. government has put in place could be effective and could be potentially really useful in putting some targeted pressure. There's other things. I mean, we really haven't done a good job in implementing the arms embargo, and there hasn't really been a renewed effort to make sure the arms embargo is working. Those are a few. I mean, the Secretary Clinton at the press conference talked about political and economic pressures. So they didn't talk about military pressures. I doubt if things that people have talked about, like a no-fly zone, are actually in the annex.
Mm-hmm. So here's another question. So what do you hope would be achieved by this pressure? What behavior do you seek to change on the part of Sudan? And it seems to me when you look at the conflict today in Darfur, it's there's more than just sort of a recalcitrance and intransigence on the part of the government of Sudan at play. You have just a general level of insecurity in certain regions. You have both sides. It seems that South Sudan is also rearming in a way, and that rebel groups are not unified. That there's banditry. It seems as if it's not like, I guess it's not clear to me the linear progress between sanction sort of Khartoum changes behavior, things get better.
Yeah. Well, certainly Khartoum is not the only game in town in terms of creating problems specifically for civilians. But in our view, turning them on a few key issues are really critical to implementation of CPA and resolving Darfur crisis. One thing I will say about putting pressure on other actors, as you know, this past week, a Darfur rebel leader, a Zagawa guy named Abu Garda, appeared before the ICC, and he is being charged with masterminding an attack against African peacekeepers in 2007, which claimed the lives of 12 peacekeepers. And so it's not like the U.S. and there are rebel leaders who are facing targeted sanctions from the United States and are on our specially designated nationals list. So it's not like the international community in the United States are only looking at Khartoum, but really when we look at this, we have the big fear in terms of violence against civilians in Sudan is really that we could face renewed hostilities between North and South Sudan. And what's been acutely worrying for us has been the uptick of violence in southern Sudan, where more than 1,000, they're saying about 1,200 civilians have been killed in attacks in southern Sudan border areas. And the fear is that Khartoum is rearming some militias and instigating this violence for two reasons. One is to further their claim, which they're making on the international stage, that South Sudan can't really govern itself. And if the international community supports independence for South Sudan, they'll be giving birth to a failed state, another Somalia, and why would anyone want to be doing that? And then the second reason is to provoke the government of South Sudan into a heavy-handed response, and even to try to get government of South Sudan to opt out of the CPA, and then they could point the finger at the government of South Sudan and say it wasn't us that screwed up the CPA. It was our southern partners. So that's one really acute worry for us, and we haven't found any smoking gun yet to prove that Khartoum is arming these militias, but they have a long history of arming militias in Darfur. As you know, they have a history of arming the Lord's Resistance Army that I know you've talked about on this program before. They have a history of arming militias in southern Sudan. And one of the other things we talked to the White House about is doing a better job of investigating and holding accountable anyone who's instigating violence in South Sudan. So that's one thing. On Darfur, we face a raft of obstacles from Khartoum. Yes, it's true. We need to get Darfur rebel unification and civil society participation in order, but humanitarian aid organizations in Darfur are still facing huge obstacles. My colleague Rebecca Hamilton just wrote a piece about how there really isn't services for victims of gender-based violence in Darfur these days, post the expulsions in March. In June, the Secretary General wrote to the Security Council about the obstacles that he was facing in terms of staffing up UNIMID and having hundreds of visas not being processed by Khartoum. And then third, a big piece that we're trying to emphasize with the Darfur peace deal is civil society has to be at the forefront of this. It can't just be the guys with guns who sit around the table and slice up the pie, right? I mean, any agreement has to have real backing from Darfur civil society. And Mo Ibrahim, a billionaire Sudanese guy, had organized a Darfur civil society conference this summer in Addis, and Khartoum refused to let any Darfuris out of the country to attend the conference. They had to cancel it. So there are a raft of things, and that's just on the violence and situation in Darfur. And then we have issues about key CPA provisions not being implemented. So it's not just one big thing. It's a whole approach towards Khartoum, and I think our general philosophy is when we hold their feet to the fire, we have a better chance at getting implementation on all these things.
Mm-hmm. So on Monday of this week, when the policy was announced, you and a few other advocacy groups held a press conference call that I participated in, which also made me want to invite you on the program to talk about this a bit more, because you made a point. You seemed a little disappointed. I think perhaps as people in your position are want to be, that the optics of the rollout of this. On the one hand, you had, Gratian and Rice, two people reportedly sort of knocking heads, standing behind, and showing their support symbolically. Standing behind Hillary Clinton and showing their support symbolically to this. But you made the point, and maybe you can elaborate it here, that, why wasn't President Obama, there for the rollout? Why wasn't this a presidential thing?
Yeah. Again, this is the expectations game. I mean, this is a senator who talked about this, took media appearances, was one of our champions. We had a candidate who in Iowa and South Carolina, in New Hampshire, I mean, all over the place, was talking about Darfur. And then we were told that they were going to try to make the president part of the rollout of the Sudan policy, and to not have him there, I mean, bigger than us, I think it sends the wrong message to actors in Sudan. One, some of the marginalized communities that are feeling, frankly, a little bit abandoned by the Obama administration, and then second, to the government. I mean, I think they are very astute observers of American politics and the D.C. scene. And I think they know when the president doesn't show up that means something. I think
if I can maybe play the devil's advocate here for a second. I think arguably there are other, priorities that demand the, president's attention that are, perhaps more pressing to American interests than, than Sudan. Iran, you have, Afghanistan certainly, obviously, these days. And it seems sort of reasonable, in a way, that Obama not attend this sort of rollout. How do you respond?
Well, I'd say two things. One is that we knew about Iran and we knew about Afghanistan, and we knew about many of the problems we're facing today during the campaign. So, people are holding him to promises he made during a campaign when he said he'd take a personal role in leading our country towards supporting peace in Sudan. And, he knew then, and his advisors knew then, that there were going to be a lot of other issues on the table, but he still made the promises. So that's one thing. The second thing is, again, we're talking about, what our groups are advocating for is a diplomatic strategy. We're not talking about U.S. troops. We're talking about investing some time and energy now, in a diplomatic strategy that will allow us to avoid a greater crisis down the road. And I think that's a worthwhile investment. And the third kind of snarky comment I'll make is, the president has appeared with the University of North Carolina NCAA basketball champions and spent some good time with them. And other athletes and people who you would say, oh, that's nice, but are not critical to U.S. national interest. So, I think if he wanted to make the time, he would have made the time, and it worries me that he wasn't there.
And so here's another question. So you've been doing this for a while now.
Yeah.
How has your job changed with the new administration? Are you saying different things? Do you have different? It seems like you have much higher expectations from Obama than you did from the Bush administration. Although even the Bush administration was saying, a lot of the right things some of the time. So I'm wondering, so how? I guess what's different for you now?
Well, it wasn't definitely higher expectations for the Obama administration. I think that's partly because of Obama himself, and partly because, Darfur and, my activism specifically came in the second Bush term, when it just didn't seem like a lot could be accomplished. It seemed like an administration running low on energy and influence. And so it's not just Obama, but also the moment he's in. Plus, the big thing that's changed, the big thing, there's a few things I wish we could have done differently in the past years, but one of the biggest is focusing in the beginning almost exclusively on Darfur and not linking in the other crises in Sudan, specifically CPA implementation in South Sudan. I think the biggest thing that's changed for us is looking at Sudan holistically, and part of that is violence in the south on an uptick. Partly it's because we see the biggest threats out there are these looming events of a planned election and a planned referendum that could have a very hard landing for Sudanese or a soft landing. And I think those are the two biggest changes. I think our advocates are committed enough to the issue that they're really willing to hold whichever president is in power, to account for their policies on Sudan. And that's what I'd say for how it's changed.
So, with our remaining time, I wanted to switch gears briefly, and because there's something else that you guys are doing that's pretty interesting. I wanted to ask you about. It's your conflict risk network. Tell me what that is, because that seems to be well, I'll let you explain it.
Yeah.
But to me, it seems to be an innovation in advocacy.
Yeah. So,
and I'll let you take it.
Sure. So it grows out of the Sudan divestment movement, and let's remember. So Sudan divestment is a more targeted version of what campaigners tried to do on apartheid. Apartheid divestment was blanket divestment. Any company operating in South Africa, you are divesting from. We've really narrowed this to four key sectors. Basically the extractives, power production, and defense. And what we had some success with on divestment is as more and more institutions were divesting and more momentum was coming behind our campaigning, we were able to engage with companies on the ground in Sudan and get them to do two big things. One is to actually change their operations to take into account local communities and change their operations so that their actual work on the ground, whether it be mining or drilling or whatever, was done in a sustainable way. And the second, harder piece, frankly, is getting those companies who many of whom have contracts with the government of Sudan, to use their leverage with the government of Sudan. So we've had companies who have said to Khartoum, we are not going to invest anymore, we're not going to sign any further contracts unless you implement the last 3 UN Security Council resolutions, XYZ. So we had success with 13 companies in that way. What we've done now is we're trying to, with our conflict risk network, we're still producing a Sudan company report, and people can find that on our website. It's a quarterly report detailing company operations from hundreds of companies. And then we get our members for Conflict Risk Network are private and institutional investors, mainly in the U.S. and Europe, who will engage with companies on the ground based on recommendations we give those companies, right? So,
So just give an example.
Yeah. So we have, let's say we have CalSTRS, right? California Teachers Retirement System, huge, controls hundreds of billions of dollars in assets. So they lock hands with Calvert, which is a socially responsible investor, and we're trying to get mainstream private investors on. So then, let's say UBS, we're trying to get UBS to join. So you would have a UBS, Calvert, a CalSTRS, and 20 or so other members. Now they're reaching out to, let's take Alstom, which is a European company working on power production in Sudan that's displaced about 50,000 Sudanese around the Marawi Dam project. So we go to them and we say, and these companies reach out and say to Alstom, we want you to do, one, we want you to engage with the local communities. 2, we want you to do an impact assessment. 3, we'd like you to engage with the government of Sudan, given your influence. And we just pound away with those actors using various different communications channels. And we feel like we can get some real leverage, given that our members are soon to control about $700 billion under management. And
have you seen evidence of this leverage being exerted yet, or is it too early to tell?
So we literally just started this in June, so we're just really on our first round of engagement with companies in Sudan. On the divestment front, like I said, we've had success with 13 companies. A company like La Mancha, which operates a gold mine in Sudan. We've had less luck with, frankly, the bigger players, the China, India, Malaysia state-owned oil companies, which are the big players in Sudan in terms of extractives, in terms of contracts to drill and export oil.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I guess when can we I guess, look to see whether or not this sort of experiment in sort of activism and advocacy is working? Should we wait a few more quarters?
Yeah, I think in really in 6 months we'll be able. When we've been going 9 months and we have our membership geared up and we're on our second round of engagement, I think we'll be able to see the results. Again, this is not the silver bullet. It's not the silver bullet. We're still going to do the government advocacy, but institutional investors and people who are managing other people's money, these people also have huge leverage with companies who in turn have real leverage with the government of Sudan, and so we're gonna give it a shot.
Like I said, it's seems to be a pretty interesting innovation in sort of how to conduct advocacy, how to pressure foreign governments. So it would be interesting to see if it works and sort of what lessons can be drawn.
Yeah.
But anyway, Sam, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll post links to whatever you need up on the site. And thanks. And maybe we'll check back in a few months to see how this is all going.
Yeah. Take care, Mark.